If you walk into a London museum today, you will see portraits of kings and generals. You will see statues of Churchill with his defiant gaze. You will see monuments to the greatest empire the world has ever known. But there is something you will not see. You will not see the receipts. You will not see the invoices that tell the real story of how that empire died. We are taught that the British Empire fell because of noble ideas. We are told it ended because of independence movements and the march of democracy. We are told that Britain, exhausted by 2 world wars, simply could not hold on anymore. That is the story in the textbooks. That is the comfortable lie. But here is the truth. The British Empire did not fall because of ideas. It fell because of arithmetic. It did not collapse. It was purchased, and the buyer was the United States of America. This is not a story about battles. This is a story about a balance sheet. This is the story of the greatest foreclosure in human history. It is the story of how Britain went from owning a quarter of the planet to being a debtor nation in less than 5 years. And it all happened legally. No tanks rolled into London. No American soldiers occupied Buckingham Palace. They did not need to. They had something far more powerful. They had the ledger. Before we talk about the collapse, we need to understand the illusion. In the summer of 1939, the British Empire was a machine of unimaginable scale. It stretched across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. The sun never set on British territory. More than 500 million people lived under the Union Jack. British ships controlled the trade routes. British banks financed the world. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. If you wanted to do business anywhere on earth, you needed British pounds. The empire was not just land, it was wealth. Britain owned gold mines in South Africa. It owned rubber plantations in Malaysia. It owned railways in Argentina and oil fields in Persia. The city of London was the financial capital of the world. Every major commodity was priced in pounds. Every major loan was underwritten by British banks. The empire was not just powerful. It was rich, or so it seemed. But beneath the marble floors of the Bank of England, there was a problem. Britain was living beyond its means. The empire was expensive to run. It required a massive navy. It required armies stationed in dozens of countries. It required administrators and infrastructure and constant investment. The cost of maintaining the empire was bleeding Britain dry. And when the war came, that bleeding became a hemorrhage. On September 3, 1939, Britain declared war on Nazi Germany. The decision was made on moral grounds. Hitler had invaded Poland. Britain had guaranteed Poland's independence. But morality does not pay for bombs. Righteousness does not fuel tanks. And within weeks of the declaration, the British Treasury realized they had made a catastrophic financial mistake. They had entered a war they could not afford. The problem was simple and brutal. Britain needed weapons. It needed steel and oil and ammunition. It needed thousands of planes and ships and trucks. But Britain's factories were not big enough. The only country with the industrial capacity to supply what Britain needed was the United States. And the United States was not interested in charity. America in 1939 was officially neutral. The American public remembered the First World War. They remembered sending their sons to die in Europe. They remembered lending money to the Allies that was never fully repaid. They were determined not to make the same mistake twice, so the U.S. Congress passed a law. It was called the Neutrality Act, and it had a clause that would destroy the British Empire. The clause was called cash and carry. Cash and carry sounded innocent. It meant that any nation at war could buy supplies from America. But there were two conditions. First, they had to pay in cash up front. Second, they had to transport the goods themselves. There would be no credit. There would be no loans. There would be no tab. If you wanted American steel, you put American dollars on the table. And if you did not have dollars, you did not get steel. This created an immediate crisis in London. Britain was wealthy on paper. It owned half the world. But wealth and liquidity are not the same thing. You cannot pay a Chicago arms dealer with a deed to a Kenyan railway. You cannot buy aviation fuel with shares in an Indian tea plantation. The Americans wanted dollars, and Britain was running out. Every week, millions of dollars flowed out of the British treasury. The spending was insane. By the spring of 1940, Britain was burning through its cash reserves at a rate that would bankrupt the nation by Christmas. The Treasury did the math. They knew what was coming. If the money ran out, the supply ships would stop. If the supply ships stopped, Britain would lose the war. It was that simple. So the British government made a decision that was kept secret from the public. They decided to liquidate the nation. They decided to sell everything that was not nailed down, and they decided to ship the gold. In the summer of 1940, the British government launched an operation with the code name Fish. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in recorded history, and it had to be done in total secrecy. If the Germans found out, they would sink the ships. If the ships sank, Britain would lose everything. The operation began in the vaults of the Bank of England. Workers moved quietly through the underground chambers. They loaded gold bars into wooden crates. The bars were so heavy that the wood groaned under the weight. Some crates were marked with the word fish to hide what was inside, but the weight gave it away. The gold was transported by armored train to the ports of Liverpool and Greenock in Scotland. They worked at night. They used warships and fast cruisers to cross the Atlantic. One ship, the HMS Emerald, carried 2,000 tons of gold bullion in a single voyage. That is more than 130 million pounds in 1940 currency. In today's money, that is billions. The captain of the Emerald was given a direct order. If the ship was about to be captured, he was to scuttle it. It was better to send the gold to the bottom of the ocean than to let Hitler have it. The crossing was a nightmare. The North Atlantic in summer is violent. Waves the size of buildings crashed over the decks. The ships sailed without radio communication to avoid detection. They were ghosts in the fog. On one voyage, the weather was so bad that the crates of gold broke loose in the hold. Bars weighing 400 ounces each slid across the deck like cannonballs. Sailors had to go below and physically wrestle the gold back into place. They were fighting a storm to save the money. When the ships arrived in Halifax, Nova Scotia, the gold was unloaded and taken by train to Ottawa. The Bank of Canada received so much gold that the floor of the vault sagged. Engineers had to reinforce the building. For a brief moment, Canada held more gold than any place on earth outside of Fort Knox, but this gold was not staying in the vault. It was being spent as fast as it arrived. But the gold was not enough. Britain also began confiscating private wealth. If you were a British citizen and you owned American stocks or property, the government took it. They called it the requisition of foreign securities. It was a polite term for legalized theft. You had no choice. You handed over your American assets. The government gave you British pounds in return. Then they sold your assets in New York to buy bullets. The sales were brutal. Everyone knew Britain was desperate. American buyers smelled blood. They offered rock-bottom prices. Britain was forced to accept. One of the most famous cases was the sale of Viscose Corporation. This was a massive textile company worth over $100 million. The American government pressured Britain to sell it to prove they were truly broke. Britain sold it for $54 million. It was a fire sale, and the money was gone in weeks. By December of 1940, Britain had sold its railways in Argentina. It had sold its mines in Africa. It had sold its shares in American companies. The empire was being auctioned off piece by piece, and still it was not enough. On December 8, 1940, the British ambassador to the United States held a press conference in New York. His name was Lord Lothian. He looked exhausted. He faced the cameras and said something that shocked the world. He said, "Well, boys, Britain's broke. It's your money we want." It was a humiliating admission. The greatest empire on earth was begging. Think about the scale of that. In less than 18 months, Britain had gone from global superpower to charity case. The Americans knew they had leverage, and they used it. President Franklin Roosevelt understood the situation. He knew Britain was finished without American help, but he also knew that the American public would not support a free handout. So he came up with a scheme. He called it Lend-Lease. He sold it to the American people with a famous metaphor. He said if your neighbor's house is on fire, you do not haggle over the price of your garden hose. You lend it to him. When the fire is out, he gives it back. It was a beautiful story. It made America sound generous. But the reality of Lend-Lease was nothing like a borrowed garden hose. It was a contract, and it was designed to break Britain's economic power forever. The Lend-Lease Act was passed in March of 1941. On the surface, it allowed America to send weapons and supplies to Britain without immediate payment. But the contract had conditions, brutal conditions. One condition was that Britain had to abandon its system of imperial preference. This was the trade system that gave British colonies favorable tariffs. It was the economic glue of the empire. The Americans hated it. They wanted access to those markets. So they wrote a clause into Lend-Lease that forced Britain to dismantle it. Britain was being asked to save the empire by agreeing to destroy it. They signed the deal. They had no choice. There was another catch. The aid was not free. The weapons were lent, but everything else was invoiced. The food, the oil, the raw materials, all of it was added to a running tab. The Americans kept meticulous records. Every tin of Spam was counted. Every barrel of oil was logged. The British tried to argue that their soldiers were dying for the common cause. They used the phrase equality of sacrifice. They believed British blood should count as payment. The Americans disagreed. To them, business was business. While Britain fought, its economy collapsed. British factories stopped making consumer goods. They made only weapons. British exports fell by 70%. American companies moved into the markets Britain had abandoned. By 1944, American products were being sold in South America, Asia, and Africa. Markets that had been British for a century were now American. The U.S. was not just helping Britain, it was replacing Britain. Then the war ended. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. In London, people danced in the streets. In Washington, the response was cold. On August 21st, President Truman signed an order. Lend-Lease was terminated. Immediately, ships crossing the Atlantic with food were ordered to turn around. Britain, which had become completely dependent on American aid, went into shock. The British government sent John Maynard Keynes to Washington. Keynes was the most famous economist in the world. He was a celebrity. He expected gratitude. He expected a gift, or at least an interest-free loan. He gave a speech about sacrifice. He talked about how Britain had stood alone in 1940. He talked about how Britain had bankrupted itself for the cause of freedom. He expected the Americans to be moved. They were not moved. The American negotiators were bankers and politicians. They offered a loan, but it came with interest. And it came with more conditions. The loan was for $3.75 billion. It was less than Keynes had asked for. And the terms were harsh. The Americans demanded that the British pound be made freely convertible into dollars. This meant anyone holding pounds could exchange them for dollars at any time. Keynes warned that this would cause a run on the pound. He was right, but he was forced to agree. He signed the deal. When he returned to London, he was broken. He died shortly after. The stress of the negotiations had killed him. In 1947, the convertibility clause went into effect. Exactly what Keynes predicted happened. Countries around the world rushed to dump their pounds and buy dollars. Britain's reserves were drained in weeks. The government had to suspend convertibility. Britain went back to the Americans for more help, and the cycle of debt continued. While America enjoyed a post-war boom, Britain entered an era of austerity. Rationing in Britain did not end in 1945. It continued until 1954. British children grew up eating powdered eggs. They wore patched clothes. They lived in a country that had won the war, but looked like it had lost. Meanwhile, West Germany, the defeated enemy, was recovering faster thanks to Marshall Plan aid that came with better terms. The debt hung over Britain for decades. Every year, the British Treasury wrote a check to the United States. In the 1960s and 70s, when the British economy was struggling, that payment was a bitter reminder. There were years when Britain asked to defer the payment. They simply could not afford it. The special relationship always felt different when the invoice arrived. The transfer of gold and technology in the early 1940s was the moment the torch was passed. The British Empire did not fall because of independence movements. It fell because the bank was empty. You cannot run a global empire without money. Britain could no longer afford garrisons in Asia. It could no longer afford to project power. The United States stepped into the vacuum. The U.S. Navy replaced the Royal Navy. The dollar replaced the pound. The American century began where the British century ended, and Britain kept paying. Through the Cold War, through the fall of the Berlin Wall, through the rise of the Internet, the payments continued until December 29, 2006. On that day, the British government sent a wire transfer to the U.S. Federal Reserve. The amount was $83 million. It was the final payment. 61 years after the war ended, Britain had finally paid off the debt. The British Treasury issued a short statement thanking the United States for its support. And that was it. Let that sink in. It took Britain more than 6 decades to pay for the privilege of surviving. The war was won in 1945. The invoice was settled in 2006. That is the true cost of survival. When we remember World War II, we think of heroes. We think of pilots and soldiers and courage, and that is real. But we must also remember the gold. We must remember the ships sailing through storms with the wealth of an empire in their hulls. We must remember the quiet meetings in Washington where islands were traded for destroyers. We must remember the documents that were signed in desperation. The British Empire was not destroyed by Hitler. It was sold to pay for the war against Hitler. The Americans did not steal it. They bought it. They bought it with contracts and loans and meticulous accounting. It was legal. It was cold. It was brilliant. So the next time someone talks about the special relationship between the U.S. and the U.K., remember this. Nations do not have friends. They have interests. In 1940, Britain needed to survive. America needed to become the dominant power on Earth. Both sides got what they wanted. But the price for Britain was everything it had built over 300 years. The gold never came back. The technology fueled the American tech revolution. The military bases became permanent American outposts. And Britain became what it is today, a proud island nation, rich in history, but no longer the master of the world. The war was won, but the empire was foreclosed. This is the story they do not teach in school. This is the story of the ledger, because in the end, history is not written by the victors. It is written by the accountants, and the numbers do not lie. Subscribe to this channel if you want to stay ahead, because when the textbooks are finally rewritten, you will be among the few who already knew the truth. If you think this story is wrong, tell me where in the comments. If you think it is right, tell me why. Either way, history belongs to those who question it. I will be reading. Thanks for watching.